It happened in less than a second. A gun raised, no warning, no hesitation, just a loud crack that echoed through Harlem and changed lives forever. The power structure around Bumpy Johnson was built on a carefully balanced system of authority, fear, loyalty, and constant surveillance where every person close to him had a defined role and understood the cost of failure. His bodyguards were not simply men who stood beside him with weapons. They were trusted gatekeepers who controlled access, information movement, and immediate violence in a world where betrayal could come from anywhere. Bumpy Johnson survived by knowing who stood closest to him and why bodyguards were selected not only for physical strength, but for mental toughness, silence, and the ability to follow orders without hesitation. They lived inside his inner circle, hearing conversations, witnessing deals, and absorbing threats, which meant they carried knowledge that could destroy or protect an empire. This proximity placed them high in the hierarchy, but also under the greatest pressure, because being close to power meant being the first suspect if something went wrong. Loyalty was constantly tested, not through words but through actions. Sometimes brutal actions, and the expectation was clear. Hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. And weakness was dangerous in organized crime. The bodyguard's authority came directly from Bumpy Johnson himself, which meant when a bodyguard acted violently, it was often seen as an extension of Bumpy's will, even if he was not physically present. This created a system where bodyguards enforced discipline, settled scores, and sent messages without needing public approval because their position already signaled permission. The streets understood this dynamic, which is why a single act by a bodyguard could shift fear levels across Harlem. People knew that if someone so close to Bumpy pulled a trigger, then the decision had already been made higher up the chain. This structure allowed Bumpy Johnson to maintain distance from certain acts of violence while still benefiting from their impact, preserving his image as a thinker and strategist rather than a reckless killer. Bodyguards absorbed the moral and legal risk, which made them powerful yet disposable at the same time, because if a bodyguard became a liability, he could be replaced or eliminated just as quickly as anyone else. The paradox of their role was that they were both protected by their closeness to Bumpy and endangered by it. Their daily lives were shaped by constant readiness, watching crowds, reading faces, anticipating threats, and staying emotionally detached because attachment could cloud judgment. This environment trained them to react instantly, which explains how point-blank violence could occur without visible emotion or delay. The structure rewarded obedience, speed, and silence, and punished doubt, hesitation, or independent thinking. Over time, this transformed bodyguards into instruments of the system, rather than individuals acting on personal morals. The power structure depended on this transformation because fear alone was not enough. Reliability was essential. Bumpy Johnson's control of Harlem required a machine that worked smoothly, and bodyguards were key components of that machine, ensuring his safety, projecting his authority, and enforcing his rules, whether through presence or force. The closer a bodyguard was to him, the more symbolic his actions became, because the streets read those actions as direct reflections of Bumpy's power and intentions, which reinforced the hierarchy and discouraged challenges while trapping the bodyguard in a role where survival depended on absolute loyalty, constant vigilance, and the readiness to cross irreversible lines without question or pause. The moment of violence, when a bodyguard pulls the trigger at point-blank range, represents far more than a simple act of killing. It is the climax of loyalty pushed to its most extreme form within organized crime around Bumpy Johnson. Loyalty was not emotional or symbolic. It was practical, immediate, and often proven through action. A bodyguard existed to protect the boss and the structure at all costs, which meant personal hesitation could endanger not only Bumpy, but the entire network that depended on him. When a threat was identified, there was no room for debate, because delay could be fatal. This environment trained bodyguards to equate obedience with survival and hesitation with betrayal. So when the order was implied, or clearly given the trig, a pull became almost mechanical, yet psychologically devastating. Pulling a gun at such close range removes distance, both physical and moral. It forces the shooter to fully confront the act and accept that there is no denial, no ambiguity, and no escape from responsibility. This kind of violence was meant to send an unmistakable message to everyone watching or hearing about it that boundaries had been crossed and consequences were final. Loyalty in this world demanded visible proof, and point-blank execution was one of the clearest signals that allegiance was absolute and unquestionable. The bodyguard in that moment sacrificed not just another life, but his own future, because once he committed such an act, he was permanently tied to the system he served. Leaving meant death. Speaking meant death, and even continued service carried the constant risk of being silenced later if he knew too much or became inconvenient. Psychologically, this level of loyalty crushed individuality. Fear and empathy were suppressed because allowing them space could cause hesitation in critical seconds. The streets interpreted these acts not as personal choices, but as extensions of Bumpy Johnson's authority, which reinforced his reputation as a man whose reach extended through others' hands. This dynamic also created a cycle where violence fed loyalty and loyalty demanded further violence, trapping everyone involved in an escalating pattern that left no room for peace or redemption. The bodyguard became both weapon and war. RNing living proof that devotion in this world was measured in blood and final actions rather than words or promises. The psychological pressure on enforcers living under constant threat and command was relentless and deeply damaging because their minds were never allowed to rest or separate from the role they played around Bumpy Johnson every day, began and ended with vigilance, scanning faces, reading tone, memorizing routines, and preparing for sudden violence. Sleep was often light and broken because danger did not follow schedules, and a single lapse could mean death. This created a state of permanent alertness, where the body and mind were flooded with stress hormones, making calm reflection, almost impossible obedience, was not just expected, it was conditioned through fear examples and survival instincts. Enforcers learned quickly that questioning orders or showing doubt could mark them as unreliable, which in that world was as dangerous as betrayal. The constant presence of weapons reinforced this pressure, because carrying a gun meant carrying the responsibility to use it instantly, without warning or hesitation. This expectation reshaped their thinking, reducing complex moral decisions into simple reactions. Act or die, follow or fall. The psychological burden was intensified by isolation because enforcers could not openly share their fears with family or friends. Revealing too much could endanger loved ones or expose secrets, so emotions were buried rather than processed over time. This suppression led to emotional numbness, where violence no longer felt shocking but routine, yet this numbness did not remove guilt or fear. It simply pushed it deeper, where it resurfaced as paranoia, anger, or sudden aggression. Living under command also meant surrendering personal identity. Their value came from usefulness, not humanity, which made their self-worth fragile and dependent on approval from those above them. Any sign of disfavor could trigger panic, because falling out of favor often led to elimination. The threat was not always external. Rivals were dangerous, but internal suspicion was worse. Knowing that the same system you served could turn on you without warning created a constant sense of being hunted, even while being protected. This mental environment explains how enforcers could carry out point-blank violence, because emotional distance was a survival tool. However, the cost was severe. Many lived with chronic anxiety, substance dependence, and a distorted sense of reality, where trust was impossible and peace felt unnatural. The pressure never truly ended, because even moments of safety felt temporary and fragile, shaping lives ruled by tension, obedience, and the quiet fear that the next command might demand an irreversible act with no way back. The ripple effect of a single trigger pull spread far beyond the immediate victim, because in Harlem during Bumpy Johnson's reign, violence functioned as communication, and every act carried meaning. A point-blank shooting instantly traveled through streets, bars, back rooms, and whispers, changing how people behaved, who they trusted, and where they stood. Rivals read the act as a warning that boundaries had been crossed, and that retaliation would be met with absolute force, which often caused them to pause, reconsider plans, or retreat entirely. Allies interpreted it as reassurance that protection was real and decisive, strengthening their loyalty and willingness to cooperate. Civilians, even those not involved in crime, felt the tension because fear reshaped daily life, altering routines, conversations, and the sense of safety in neighborhoods. Power balances are fragile, and one decisive act can tilt them dramatically. After such a shooting, Smaller crews might dissolve, align with stronger factions, or seek protection under Bumpy Johnson's influence, because survival depended on being on the right side of authority. Law enforcement also felt the ripple effect, because sudden violence drew attention, increased patrols, and intensified investigations, forcing shifts in how operations were conducted. Money routes, meeting places, and communication methods often changed overnight. Within the criminal network, the trigger pull served as a reset, reinforcing hierarchy and reminding everyone of the consequences of defiance. This often reduced internal challenges, because fear restored order, but it also planted seeds of resentment and quiet plotting, as those who felt threatened looked for safer positions or long-term escape. Opportunities. The emotional impact was just as powerful. Witnesses carried trauma even if they said nothing, and rumors exaggerated details, making the act feel even more ruthless than it already was, which amplified its psychological reach over time. Repeated incidents like this shaped Harlem's identity as a place where power was enforced without hesitation, influencing how outsiders viewed the community and how residents understood authority. The ripple effect was not temporary. It lingered, altering relationships, trust levels, and the unspoken rules that governed interactions long after the gunshot faded, showing how a single moment of violence could redefine control, fear, and survival across an entire environment. Lessons about fear, authority, and consequences behind crime. Legends are stark and unforgettable, because every story from Bumpy Johnson's world carries more than intrigue. It carries instruction about human behavior under extreme conditions. Fear was not incidental, it was the currency of power. Those who controlled fear controlled actions, loyalty, and outcomes. Bodyguards, enforcers, and even civilians learned quickly that hesitation could be fatal, and that authority demanded obedience not just in word, but in immediate, irreversible acts. The lesson is that authority in such systems is reinforced through both presence and action. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was maintained because every command, every demonstration of power, and every violent act signaled that his authority was absolute and non-negotiable. Con. Sequences were immediate and visible, creating a culture where understanding the rules was survival. The point-blank shooting by a bodyguard exemplifies how consequences operate in such environments. It teaches that decisions in high-stakes contexts are rarely abstract. They carry real, irreversible weight. Every act becomes a statement, a lesson to all who observe. Witnesses learn what is tolerated and what is punishable without needing explicit rules. In this way, violence becomes a language, and the lessons extend beyond those directly involved. Power is conveyed, fear is instilled, and respect is demanded, not requested. Another lesson lies in loyalty and its complex dynamics. Loyalty in Bumpy Johnson's world was not sentimental, it was transactional and enforced through constant vigilance and the possibility of immediate consequences. Those who failed to internalize these dynamics quickly learned that survival required complete alignment with authority. Mistakes were not forgiven lightly, hesitation was not tolerated, and understanding one's position in the hierarchy was a matter of life and death. Observing the consequences of a trigger pull teaches us that authority must be respected or contested carefully, because each choice has ramifications that ripple outward. Finally, these events illustrate the human cost of such a life. Those who enforce authority, carry out violent acts, or witness them live with lasting psychological impact. Fear, stress, and moral conflict shape their identities and decisions long after the moment passes. Legends like Bumpy Johnson are built not just on charisma or intelligence, but on the careful orchestration of fear, loyalty, and consequences, all demonstrated through real, often brutal events. These lessons remind us that behind every legendary figure in crime history, there is a network of human actions, choices, and repercussions that teach as much about human nature as they do about power. In essence, the lessons of fear, authority, and consequences from this world are timeless. Authority demands recognition, loyalty must be proven, and every action carries weight. Observing these dynamics provides insight into how power operates in any environment, the cost of crossing lines, and the human price paid by those who live at the edge of law, order, and survival.